Welcome to another episode of Craft Chocolate TV. My name is Dylan, and this is Dan. And Dan is hesitant because of the way I might introduce him. But I'm going to say nice things. Dan's actually who taught me how to make chocolate, introduced me to chocolate, more on the cacao side and post-harvest handling side. And Dan has become an expert, a cacao consultant, mostly on post-harvest handling, fermentation, and not many people know this, but also makes a lot of chocolate at Kamananui Estate. And so Dan O'Doherty is somebody I work very closely with because we also have a farm on the North Shore. And so you guys have seen some episodes or footage on our farm out there, and Dan is the consultant and half owner of that farm. So some of the things that we're going to speak about, in fact, why don't we get rolling with where does flavor come from?
Ooh.
Yeah. Loaded.
Well, I think what you say,
question.
what you often say is pretty spot on, which is kind of like,
right.
You start with good beans, you're going to get good chocolate.
Right. So I want to go the next layer below that.
Well, I don't want to...
We're obviously with beans. We're looking at a combination of genetics, fermentation, and whatever terroir we want to define terroir as.
Right. Well, I guess, we'll start with this whole fermentation thing, right? And so, you're fermenting the pulp and causing a lot of physical and chemical changes in the seed.
And that's it, real quick. When we compare it to wine all the time, the grapes are the fruit.
That's what you're drinking.
Actually, yeah.
What you're fermenting in cacao, you're actually discarding in many cases.
Right. We're working with the seed, and so it's not as comparable in that way.
Right. Well, one of the things that's only really come up last couple of years is that, I was in Ecuador at their research farm, in Iap in the government station, and, one of their guys is breaking these fruits, these new hybrids, and he's breaking them open and holding them up to my nose. And he's like, see? And I was like, what's going on here? I wasn't aware of it at the time. This was maybe 5 years ago, but they have started to link some of the aromas that come from really nice cacao to the volatiles. So the aromatic compounds that are in the pulp itself, some of that does go in.
It makes me think of what Colin says. So Colin is somebody we work with on the Big Island. He's planting out an orchard. And he had one tree, and the pulp always tasted like Skittles.
Right.
And so the pulp is the fruit. When we say cacao is a fruit, the pulp is the fruit. And it varies dependent on all kinds of things, like the hybrid, whatever we want to say as genetic.
Right.
And we can get into that too, because you're probably the right person to ask and try and simplify like we're five.
I mean, I'm stoked on this whole thing, though, because, nobody really knows the answer to that broad question.
Right. Anybody who says they know the answer to that one is making it up.
Yeah, BSing. Yeah, for sure. I think, the cool thing is, and I say this a lot, is, I could do this my entire life and still kind of only scratch the surface. I've seen, I've worked in, I don't know, it's like 25 countries or so now, and I've genotyped a lot of the material as well. You also have these very different terroirs, foothills of the Andes and, Colombia, you have, this same set of trinitario clones, and then you'll go down, in Santander and there'll be the same clones, but you get different sized fruits, different flavors, things like that.
For anyone who doesn't know, trinitario is commonly referred to, one of the three main genetics of cacao, but break that down. When I say one of the three main genetics,
well, that's like that's the old school classification, right?
Now what is there, 16?
Well, the last paper shows but that's 2008. It's 10 or so different groups. At this point, it's not been published yet, but there have been more and more collections in the upper Amazon and a lot of the headwaters and the tributaries that feed into the Amazon, and keep finding new clusters of the Bolivian,
the little one.
Nacional. Yeah, that's a wild type that was not included back in that 2008 paper. I've done some collections with Luisa in Upper Amazon, Brazil, and
Luisa Abraham Cacao, Abraham Chocolate in Sao Paulo.
Luisa Abram, yeah. So, I mean, she's made her entire chocolate company incredibly out of wild cacao.
Which I gotta say, not only is really cool sounding, but also is some of the best chocolate I've tasted out of Brazil.
That first sample of the Purus when I went down there to work on,
This cacao
dried
sample,
blueberries,
tiny little beans, and came.
We actually
it tasted like blueberries.
We actually have some of these
They really
tiny little
tasted
beans.
like blueberries.
I mean, it almost doesn't look like cacao. It's like little shrunken almonds, you know. And you hold that up to...
I think these are even bigger than the ones that you brought back the first time.
And then you hold that up to like a classic big seed.
But just to clarify again, when we say there's like maybe 10 to 16 varietals, okay, some of them haven't been published yet. And when I say varietal, I'm trying to draw a comparison with a grape varietal like Pinot Noir or Cabernet or Merlot.
See, those are clones, though. When you're talking about these wild, you know, these original types of cacao, they would more accurately be called populations, right? So it's not only is it not a single clone, it's a wide, you know, genetic diversity of individual trees. The thing is, right, vast majority of these were never used in the breeding, right? So any wild collections combined with wow, cocoa moth in the wine.
Let's talk about that one.
The cocoa moth.
We'll get to the cocoa moth.
All right, well, cocoa moth powder.
No, it'll be fine.
Well, here's the thing, right? So to put it in a nutshell, right? So first there was Criollo, domesticated by the Olmecs, the Mayans. You know, it's thousands of years old.
They wanted Criollo, which is the white-seeded varietal, mainly because it didn't have the pigment which is associated with astringencies and bitterness.
And bitterness, right? But the other thing that, you know, people talk about this legendary Criollo, there's very little in commercial cultivation. It was never bred for chocolate bars, right? I mean, chocolate bars only became an actual thing, a solid bar in like the 1800s, yeah, right? So it's interesting, it was domesticated for a beverage, right? And what happened is several hundred years ago in Trinidad, you know, at that point in time, 1800s, people only cultivated Criollo. There was no other. There was wild cacao in the forests, but nobody cultivated them, right? And what happened was this mysterious event called the blast. Nobody knows whether this is like a hurricane or whether this was a disease, you know, wiped out a lot of these Criollo trees in Trinidad, right? And so what they did was they went to the mainland, South America.
What century are we talking about?
It's like 1800s. They went to the mainland and they brought back some wild type cacao that we would now refer to as a melonado, right? And what they did was they planted that in the holes where Criollo trees had died or cut some of them down. But in the end, it was still a mix, right? It was a melonado heavy. What happened is over hundreds of years, these trees randomly cross-pollinated and produced, you know, you call like a hybrid progeny, right? And people realized, oh wow, like these trees have some of the characteristics of the Criollo that we really like and are used to, but they have the vigor and the strength. And it's interesting was this is a phenomenon really well known in plant breeding, known as F1 hybridization. It's
the first
filial generation, right? So when you take two separate genetically rather inbred lines, which the Melonado was as well. It's another story as to why some wild cacao is inbred, but basically the Amazon goes from, you know, the lower reaches of the Andes all the way through gradually and discharges in the Atlantic. I mean, and at the very bottom where the, you know, Amazon discharges, that's kind of the end of the line. So the center of diversity is up high, right? So in Melonado stuff, it's growing wild down in the state of like Pará and Brazil, was actually very genetically uniform. Incidentally,
because that's further down.
Yeah, right. It's far away from the center of diversity, which is in the what they call the Upper Amazon. So what happened is, you know, people said, hey, these hybrid trees, you know, are pretty nice, but a couple hundred years went by, and then finally, around the turn of the 20th century, you know, researchers down there said, you know, let's do, you know, what you call like farmer-assisted selection. So basically, they went around to farmers all over the island of Trinidad who have now had many generations of these randomly admixed trinitario.
And this is why when you say it's more of a population.
It is population, yeah, but we're getting to how now you get varietal with trinitario, right? So what happened was they and this is kind of becoming popularized again now, is this, farmers that spend every day in the field, they're the ones that see, these trees every day, harvest them. They have a feel that you wouldn't as a researcher coming in at one snapshot moment in time, right? So what you do is you go and you interview these farmers and you say, hey, which of these trees are the best? And like I did some of this in Belize, and the question I would phrase it was, if you could have, 1,000, your entire farm of just the best tree, the best 5 trees, which ones? Mm-hmm. And without fail, these farmers can take you. You go walk in for 5 minutes through and they're like, this one right here.
Yeah, this one produces 135 pods every year.
Right. So what the researchers in Trinidad decided to do was, well, let's cast a wide net. We'll kind of thin it down. And they did 100 clones, right? And so these were known as the ICS series, Imperial College Selection. You'll still see ICS.
If that originated out of Trinidad.
In Trinidad, right.
Okay.
And what they were is just Amelinado and Criollo. There was no other genetic contributor to that original population, right? And it was, now look, when you Criollo and Amelinado, and whether one is a pollen donor and the other, male and female, it's a 50-50 cross, that F1, right? After that, they just keep randomly recombining. So you have a 50-50 Criollo Amelinado that might get back crossed to either Criollo or Amelinado.
Become more dominant in one of them.
And nobody's controlling us. They're not hand pollinating. So hundreds of years go by and you end up with this, just shuffling the deck over and over and over again. So nothing's 50-50 anymore. Right? So you have all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors. You had some with very high percentage of white seeds. You had others of deep purple seeds.
And so on our farm, you've recreated this for the first time since 18 something?
Yeah, but it's deliberate, right? So that was incidental, right? So what we took when I was working at the university is we have some pure Criollo lines and we had some pure Amelinado lines. Like I talked about a little bit, plant genetics, right? You get this phenomenon known as F1 hybrid vigor. And the reason for that is any inbred line, right? You see like purebred dogs, right? They produce litters of dogs that look very similar to the parents, right? The problem is they have hip dysplasia, and they have all these other genetic problems, right? All those genetic problems, almost without fail, are recessive traits, right? So you need 2 defective copies. This is like this in royal families, like hemophilia, right? You need 2 mutated copies. 1 gene of hemophilia, you're okay, right? Cystic fibrosis is like this, right? So what happens is, as you build up a population like Criollo to have this repeated, predictable seed-based offspring, white seeds, right? The other traits, that are common that you would use to describe that. But the double-edged sword there is you build up what you call deleterious mutations, right? Mm-hmm. So now when you take 2 unrelated inbred lines and you cross them, you get everyone, people included, right? You have 2 copies of every gene, one from your mom, one from your dad, right? So, but what happens now is you don't ever get what you call like a homozygous state. So you never get 2 identical copies of a gene. You get 2 different forms. So what that means is it essentially cancels out the possibility in that F1 generation of having any negative, harmful mutations.
So is this one of the issues with Criollo?
It is, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's just inbred.
It's inbred, right? And you get a phenomenon, the technical term is inbreeding depression, and that's for, animals and plants.
Okay, so
here's the thing, nobody saw that F1 hybrid, right? And the great thing, you'll see this with all sorts of crops, is you get a very uniform height, a very uniform structure, uniform seasonality, all of these things, only in that first generation. The second generation, everything's all over the map. Different shapes, colors, sizes, right?
You got a slide when you do presentations, and it shows the progeny of that F1 being extremely diverse.
Right. Yeah, it's all over the map.
Yeah.
Right.
So coming back to flavor, that F1 would have a very similar flavor time after time, especially if you took scion from it.
Well, every individual tree produces fruits that look the same, seeds that are the same size, same pulp sugars. You basically end up, now you could call that a varietal in a way. It's not vegetatively propagated like with grapes, right? It's all cuttings, right? All fruit trees, right, are grafted. And they are, you can call that a cultivar, right, or variety, whatever you want. In this case, there may be a little genetic difference between each tree in that F1 generation, but you cannot see it. And as far as I can tell, you can't taste it. I mean, it was kind of out of curiosity to see, like something that people clearly saw. It wasn't done on purpose. I did hand pollinations, right? But clearly people were like excited about this. And that's why instead of just planting the amelinado, the new stuff in Trinidad, they were like, hey, like the sum here is better than the parts. So let's just keep planting more trinitario trees rather than the old criollo or the new amelinado.
Okay, so let's touch on what you did when you hand pollinated. So can you describe for everyone when you wanted to create this F1, this hybrid that turned into a recreation of trinitario?
Yeah.
What did you do for that?
So, very tiny flowers, right? So you go out.
And in a flower, it's like smaller than your fingernail, your pinky fingernail.
It's like the size of a match head, say.
Yeah.
Right.
It's very tiny. That's perfect.
So you take like a little film canister, right? And you get a little ring of modeling clay. And you get a little like mosquito netting, because you want this little tube to be able to breathe, because you're going to place it over an unopened flower.
You're going to hand pollinate it.
But here's the thing:
tube over it.
You need to exclude the actual regular natural pollinator, right? The little midges that fly around.
So timing's important.
Well, so you go in the day before a bud's going to open. You can tell a bud that's getting ready to open will start to get little seams and cracks. You can see it's going to pop, right? So you take a little ring of modeling clay, put that on the trunk, right? And then you push this tube on top of it, covering it entirely, right? You come out early in the morning the next day, and with really tiny forceps,
Forceps being?
Little tweezers.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you have a male, a pollen donor tree that you've covered a bud, and you have the female, right? And you very carefully...
This ensures the perfect cross.
Well, ensures that you know exactly what the parent is, right? These midges, they fly around, right? And they might visit 5-6 flowers, picking up little bits of pollen from each flower,
and a
right?
midge is the pollinator of the cacao flower, and we happen to have it here, which we're very fortunate.
Yeah,
it's almost microscopic.
Yeah, I mean they make a fruit fly look kind of like a school bus compared to a Mini Cooper. I mean these things are very slight. They kind of have this irregular flight path, but they're so small, they can fly into and access the internal parts of the cacao flower, right? And what happens is they have little bristly hairs on their back, right? And the pollen grains are kind of sticky. They get stuck in these hairs, right? So, you have 1,000 trees in a plot, right? And that midge gets up early in the morning and is maybe visiting 4 or 5 flowers, picking up a whole load of different pollen before it deposits some, right? And so you have inside a single pod, you can have multiple parents, like paternal contribution, right? So there's no way.
So let's break that down a little more, because when you open a cacao pod up and you have, say, 50 seeds,
right?
They could, hypothetically, each have a different parent. They only have one parent that's the same,
right?
But they could have 50 different
the
dads.
maternal parent because it's the pod that you harvest from the mother tree, right? But the thing is, each seed is the result of a pollen grain using with an ovule. And because of the way the midges work, they could have, technically infinite, but 5, 6, say, pollen sources they picked up, and they're not, they're just
generally the closest trees.
Yeah, they don't fly more than they think maybe 30, 50 foot a day. They don't
that's
really.
pretty far for something that's microscopic almost.
But that's like max. I mean, they're weak flyers. If the winds are up,
the wind's moving them.
Yeah. So you don't. If you're breeding, you can't have this kind of thing, right? So you cover up the bud, you come and uncover it briefly. You apply pollen from the father tree that you want, right? And then you recover.
And then you get a 50-50 cross.
Yeah. Well, right.
Right, because otherwise you plant out seeds from a pod and you could have every different color and...
Well, that's what they call it, half siblings. If you just break a pod and plant it,
the mother.
You know the mother, and they may be, some of them are very likely full siblings, but there's also potential of half siblings. I mean, like dogs, you see this, right? You have a litter, you can have multiple fathers for that litter.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that's not, you don't want this randomness, right? I'm trying to test, like, what did this look like a couple of 100 years ago? And, I suspected from the history of, if they brought in a new cacao, but Trinidad became a producer of hybrid cacao, it would lead you to believe, well, if the new cacao was so great, why didn't they just only plant that, right? So, somebody had to be there to see this.
Let's go on the other end. Let's tie it back into the Amazon where you're on the tributary, and it's just probably all the same population.
It is, yeah. On a given river
what
system.
Does that history look like? So it's like some tree ends up somehow planted on this tributary in the middle of nowhere in the Amazon and
Not planted.
deposited.
Dispersed, yeah.
And usually it takes some type of larger animal to do that.
Right.
That grows, and it has somehow reproduced. Monkeys, people, pigs, whatever it might be.
They think it was giant land sloths, but,
Really?
Yeah. Like megafauna, right? I mean, North America used to be full of megafauna, huge, animals.
Like massive sloths.
Yeah, massive
Slow
ground sloths. They
moving ground sloths.
They weren't in the trees, right? I mean, you think about this like with avocados, and with the huge seed, right? Dispersed by animals, it's going to have to be a pretty big animal. And cacao seeds aren't huge, but I mean, that's
but the
that's not
pods
going to
are
pass
pretty
through
big.
a bird, right?
No, it's not.
Right. So what would happen was, cacao itself evolved somewhere in that upper Amazon, right? And as it's, guaranteed, I mean, I've seen this in the river. Sometimes you'll see, the Amazon floods, comes up 30 and 40 foot, right? In the rainy season, it's literally bulldozing the forest sometimes, right? Just carrying entire cacao trees away. So I imagine then in some ways that's a dispersal agent as well.
It just deposits a tree and then somehow roots.
Or the
established.
fruits get ripped off, whatever. But what happened, right, is as cacao, a couple of, individuals, what you call like, founder effects, right? So let's say, you have the Ukiali River, right, which is a big feeder, right? But it has several branch, rivers, before it finally makes its way into the Amazon. And, millions of years ago, one pod or, a handful of seeds, got pulled off into this other tributary where there was no cacao, right? And it's a small number of individuals, right? So it's a very small slice of the genetic diversity in the mother population, right? And so what happens then is that makes its way, starts populating somewhere on one of these tributaries. It starts to produce and reproduce with its siblings or its close relatives, and eventually expands. And now you have a population that early on is just leaning towards a single slice, but then there's going to be different selective pressures, right? You're going to have things like for example the Purus River and the Juruá River are in part of the upper Amazon in Brazil where it's notoriously soggy, wet compared to like the soil is just flooded. You don't see a lot of animals. You see a lot of birds. It's just hard to make your way through that, right? And that's being able to tolerate flooding, which is, is probably, beneficial in that case, right? So, once the population builds up and you have a couple of thousand or, tens of thousands of trees from that original founder population, right? Now there's something that is, the trees that aren't able to tolerate standing water for 6 months are less likely to make more fruits.
Standing water for 6 months.
I've seen it like that, yeah. Like literally,
And
like
the trees don't suffocate because the conditions must be anaerobic.
well, there's
for the
a.
root
It's
system.
not anaerobic. No, there's a lot of sand and silt in those soils.
But there's no drain. Like if it's in standing water, or maybe I'm missing something.
There's still air pockets. I mean, I can tell you it survives. So I mean, Luisa and I, right, were, on the Juruá River. I guess it would be 3 years ago. And for the first time harvested this wild cacao on that river system and fermented it. And this was this community, the first time they had ever seen it processed, right? We wanted to come back the next year and they said, oh, it's really flooded. I don't think we're gonna be able to harvest anything this year. And so they were gonna cancel, but I said, why don't we just go down there to like show face? It was the first time the year before that we were really committed to doing this. And amazingly, we take the long canoe ride, 5 or 6 hours from the nearest town down to this community, and they go to show us the cacao trees. We're literally in a canoe in 3 3-4 foot of water, like canoeing through the Amazon forest under the canopy, because the flooding had been so extreme that year and the rainfall kept coming that like you're just seeing cacao trees sticking out of like what looks like I don't even know what you call it, a lake forest.
Right, and everyone, the small village that was probably the closest was on stilts.
They were, all the houses on stilts. I guess, but what I'm saying, right, is, you get this, you have different climate conditions, right? And for example, also, a flooded forest, before a new plant, say cacao, comes in, right, it's going to lean heavily on different trees, right? Things that are already pre-adapted, right? So you not only have like a, say, soil and water condition in a new area, but you also have different competitive pressures from vegetation, right? And this is how plants in general, end up occupying a niche, right, and evolving. So the random individuals that happen to be able to have a mutation or otherwise are adapted to these conditions, they thrive. They produce, say, 100 pods a year, whereas the ones that don't do well in the stagnating water, they produce much fruit. So, it's really hard to wrap your head around, like millions of years, but a lot can happen with these, like I said, selective pressures.
So maybe now's a good time to plug a few things. Dan's also a cacao broker, and so I don't know if you're currently selling anything out of the Amazon, but let's talk about some of the locations and beans that you do work regularly with and sell. And I'll elaborate on that. If you've ever had craft chocolate, there's a good chance that Dan in some way helped improve the flavor behind that bar. And so let's talk about the main origins you work with, which would be Costa Esmeraldas, Ucayali, Peru, the Amazon, obviously. I know that you've been to Zorzal in the Dominican Republic. You've been to Coco Camili in Tanzania. Right. These are, the main fixtures that we would work with. I know that you've been to Belize a lot with Maya Mountain. Right. So you've had a hand in some way assisting and improving the qualities that would used to be commodity cacao, right, and now they're being sold for 2, 3, 4 times the market rates. So what are some of the more interesting farms that you work with and that you sell, or you assist in selling? Because you actually just link up the farmer with the end purchaser, which would be somebody like Manoa Chocolate as the chocolate maker, right, is buying from Costa Esmeraldas.
Right. I would start with Costa Esmeraldas, right? So, with these different, projects, My Mountain, say Coco Camili, these are guys that were already up and running, buying from the local community, consolidating that, wet cacao, right, and processing it. And they just wanted refinements. They were like, hey, we think we have a really good product, or in fact, we do have a really good product, but, we'd like some outside help, somebody with some experience, right, to like drive that up. Now with Esmeraldas, I think that's a good starting
point. That
point.
one's one of the most interesting because it ties in so well with what we're discussing.
Right. So Esmeraldas, is a really unique situation, right? Because when I met the Salazar family, they were selling their cacao, unbaba, wet or escurrido, drained overnight.
Explain when you say unbaba.
Unbaba is actually the direct translation in Spanish is in slime.
Which is very much what it looks like.
Right. So it's just fresh broken pods and the pulp covered seeds, right? And there's a marketplace in some countries for that. In Ecuador, absolutely, in the city of Esmeraldas, you can drive up in your truck.
In most places, there seems to be.
Right. Or escurrido, which just means drained, right? And that's means you broke the pod and you put them in bags, but it sat overnight, right? So they'll pay different prices. Carson was just kind of right in the middle of it.
That's Carson's first appearance on Craft Chocolate.
Right.
He's been hiding for about a year and a half.
We generally try to keep him on camera. So when I first met the Salazar family, right, they were selling all of the cacao from their fairly young, orchards.
Like 150 hectares or something of old cattle pasture.
The original orchard was about 100 hectares, and it was when they
converted it into a cacao forest, basically.
Yeah, there's orchard. Cacao. It's a polyculture. There's cacao. There's oranges. There's some hardwood trees. There's some streams that run through the property that still have, some of the native, trees and vegetation along them. But they were pretty young, right? They were starting out, and Yeah, they're driving about an hour, hour and a half to Esmeralda City to sell this wet cacao, and you get even less money for wet cacao than you do dry, right? Because the buyer is then doing the process. So, I mean, the unique thing about that was starting from square one. There was no preconceived notion of like, this is how we process it. These are what our boxes are like, right? I met them and said like, hey, like, let's.
And so this is where you kind of step in. I mean, your actual job at this time became cacao consulting.
Well, it already was.
Yeah.
Right, but
yeah. When I first met you, it was what you were studying,
right,
and I was just interested in what you were doing,
right,
and realized I didn't want to go to school anymore and just wanted to make chocolate.
Well, we were kooky and thought we were going to make a chocolate company out of local Hawaiian chocolate, and all these.
It was a nice idea.
We're very small, and we were like, well, these little ferments are going to be different each one, but we'll really emphasize the difference in every single batch, and then as we kind of started to look into it, it was like, well, there's really not even that much of this cacao from small farms, and also it's quite putrid and terrible.
Most of it was terrible.
Right. Oh yeah, awful.
Yeah. First name for Manoa chocolate was actually Pacific Island chocolate until we realized there's nothing we can even get from the Pacific that's any good.
That's right. So my true kind of love and passion, right, is the cacao itself, the trees, the travel that comes with it, and really exploring, like you said, in the beginning, this flavor, this real rainbow of flavor. And I think until the specialty market,
this is the first time we're actually being able to showcase it as well.
Yeah.
And it's been 10 years since I started learning from you.
Yeah.
Making chocolate.
In the lab there.
In the lab. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I started with, making chocolate, not working with the trees.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a paid, research assistantship, so it paid my tuition. And
see, my understanding was always farmers started asking questions, and a position at UH was created for you to understand how why this pod was red and this pod was yellow.
No, we were doing a little state variety trial, right? So we had some local selections, we had some Criollo, we had a classic.
At UH, it has to be tied to agriculture somehow.
What's that?
Any position, because it's a U.S. It's an extension agency.
There's food science department, but I was in the tropical plant soil sciences department, right? And what I mean is chronologically. The first I met the professor Skip Bittenbender, who was trying to make chocolate out of these locally selected trees that we thought were improved varieties, right? And then in a couple of weeks we started going out to the farms, and then that's when I was like, this is
more interesting.
This is more interesting to me. Where are we? Esmeraldas?
We can go into Esmeraldas again, or we can discuss the history of Hawaiian cacao.
Oh, okay. We can do that. So,
in fact, all right, let's wrap Esmeraldas up a little bit, because it is one of Manoa Chocolate's main sources. It is Esmeraldas.
Okay,
is
cool
3
case.
clones, and
Right.
it's 1 varietal. Well, varietal being an ambiguous term, kind of, because it's neo-national.
Okay, semantically, yeah, it's complicated, but basically what you can say is that, yeah, it's 100 hectares of hybrids that are 50% nacional, right? So they all share that. The other parent is either a trinitario or a melanado. They were calling that. They were calling the other parent. It's honestly, there's some parallels between what happened in Ecuador. They had their own domesticated type, nacional. Wasn't domesticated for as long as the Criollo, but it was domesticated, inbred cacao, and in the late 1800s, witch's broom and Monalia disease started wiping these things out, and they imported.
Real quickly,
yeah.
Explain witch's broom and Monalia.
So these are 2 cacao-specific fungal pathogens that, without any management or control, can cause up to 100% loss. Yeah, so pretty bad stuff. And Ecuador has both of those diseases. You go to Bahia, Brazil, they just have witch's broom. You go north of the Panama Canal, and they only have Monalia, right? But you go south of the Panama Canal, you go into Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and you have both of these. And it's just, some years are worse for one disease than the other, but it's a real struggle, right? So,
well, and what's the estimated destruction or loss from these?
It can be 100% with no management. You can literally have all the fruits drop off the tree.
it's-
It doesn't kill the trees.
It's decimating.
It's decimating, right? So Ecuadorians were like, hey, we need to bring in some fresh blood here, right? So they brought in pods from Venezuela, and they were just generically called, Venezolano amarillo, yellow Venezuelan. And same thing happened. These trees were planted along with the Nacionals, and over decades,
same story again.
kind of the same story.
Just accelerated.
Right, so Costa Esmeraldas, right, grows 3 clones, right, that are all 50% Nacional. And these are known as boring, like all cacao names, EET, 95, 96, 103, right?
Yeah, we really need to come up with some new names.
And kind of like Trinidad, right? You see famous ICS clones, ICS 1, 6, 39, 60, 95. These are, if you see in any Latin American country, the word fino de aroma, referring to cacao, it's almost always going to be these ICS clones, these trinitario, what you call classic trinitario. Well, Ecuadorian government also, they released 6 clones, EET clones that were 50% Nacional, in the, I think, 60s or 70s. And like the ICS, which had 100 clones, it ended up getting thinned down to 6. Ecuador's 6 has been kind of thinned down to 3, essentially. But what's really interesting, you have a whole farm that is actually very uniform genetic material, right? It's all on a single estate, right? And it's interesting because that estate is
planted in blocks or all blended?
It's all blocks, but it's all mixed. Those 3 clones, right? But I went down there to say, to take a look and build some very basic boxes and drying structures, and personally do the fermentation and drying the way that, my own personal methods, right? And then I brought it back to the U.S., right, and put samples out to Dandelion, to you, to a bunch of other people, and got feedback blind saying, hey, this cacao is really great. If we could get more of this, we'd be willing to pay this price. I asked for people to put in these letters of intent or interest, right? And then what we did was I was able to design entirely, the post-harvest facility, which was designed for efficiency and designed for like cleanliness and for really, basically it was like hard to screw it up. So it's a really nice flow, right? A truck backs up to the cascades. It moves, all the wet cacao moves about 1 meter into the top box, cascades down at the bottom of the building, and actually falls through purposely built holes in the floor where it drops directly on the drying
it's designed
racks, right?
methodically for volume.
Right, so that was a super cool project for me because I walked into a farm that was of significant size, of a really unique, excellent quality planting material, and a blank slate. No preconceived notions on how to, that's the thing you'll fight with. You go into some of these areas, rural areas, and you say, well, what, this cacao's bad, right? You try not to just come right out and say that, but you say, well, we need to work on this, and why do you do this particular practice? Say why do you ferment it for this long, or why is the box like that? And people are kind of like, well, I don't know. That's kind of how it's done around here.
Yeah.
Or like my dad did it like that,
exactly.
right?
That's this is how we've done it for generations.
Right, but the Salazar family was not a cacao growing family, up until they rehabbed this old cattle pasture. So it was like, and great people, easy to work with. And I was like, okay, this is awesome. Huge farm, high quality variety, and the ability to completely, determine what the best fermentation protocol was for that cacao, design a facility for it. And then we finally get to this moment where they're like, well, we have this great cacao and lots of people want it. But
see, this is counterintuitive because the fact that they were never in cacao was the biggest advantage.
In a lot of ways.
In them now being the best quality coming out of Ecuador, not just by our standards.
Right.
Because at the Salon de Chocolat last year? They won best cacao for South America. Yeah. And so we're not alone in thinking that it's really, really good.
Right. So, that was...
And that's all because of the way that the post-harvest handling system has been set up.
On the harvesting itself, too. So it's unique in that...
it's all the nuanced details from every step of harvesting all the way through drying.
I say this a lot in my presentations, right? So, if you break down and analyze every step from cutting fruits off the tree to the final dry bean, right? So you think, how many steps are there? And you're like, well, how frequently do you cut the fruits? when you cut them, do you let them sit in the field for a day or two before you open them?
What is ripe?
Right, what is ripe, right. Well,
what is ripe, and then, like you just said, when you leave it in the field for too long, all of a sudden the brick levels start to drop.
Well, they get over-ripened, right? The pulp starts to degrade or whatever, right? But if you break down every step, right, so actually cutting the fruits, opening the fruits, how do you transport it? Do you put it in mesh bags? Do you put it in 5-gallon buckets? Do you let it drain? Do you leave it in the sun? Do you leave it in the shade? Right? What are the boxes made of? What's the dimensions of the box? Are there holes? Are there slats? If you look at every step, to get a dried bean, you're like, oh my God, there's dozens of steps, right? And so I think the difference between like pretty good cacao and really excellent cacao is picking apart each one of those steps.
Yeah, that's probably the best takeaway from the entire discussion we've had
right?
so
So you
far.
get this little fractional improvement maybe on step 1 and step 7 and things that were overlooked. And you add them all up, and you're like,
When you multiply it by
now
12.
I get like a double-digit percentage increase in quality, right? The other thing is, what a ferment level, time or turning protocol that works in one area is not.
Doesn't apply.
It doesn't necessarily apply.
Drying as well.
Right? And the funny thing is, really, in the end, it's. I have my own concept of like when I go to a new farm and do the fermentation, the post-harvest, and revise everything and do the trials myself, sling in the cacao. The only way you're really gonna understand it and know it, and that's what I've always done is I'm down there slinging the cacao on the especially in the trials myself.
And then to go a step further is you are also making a lot of chocolate. So as a chocolate maker, you also understand what you want from the farm.
Yeah.
And this is the disconnect that most people don't ever put together.
But that's only a new thing for me. I worked with
you
a lot of
always
chocolate
knew how to make
makers.
chocolate. Now
Right.
you're actually making chocolate at the same scale we're doing it now with the same equipment.
Unfortunately, yeah.
You're not as happy to do it, but it has made you a better consultant in so many ways, as well as on the egg side.
Absolutely. But I think the funny thing is, right, I have my own ideas for any given cacao origin or type of like what I think is the best, fermentation profile, say, right? But, I send it out blind and, the funny thing is in the end, it's the user. It's like, I've had people say like, oh, I really like this cacao. I think it's perfect, kind of spot on, balanced. And they're like, well, could you give it another day? We'd like it a little bit harder. And you know what? If you really want to, make these businesses viable.
Right. To some degree, it's subjective.
It is absolutely subjective, right?
But not always.
No.
There's very clear definitions of bad and good.
Sure.
Yet it's fuzzy in between.
Absolutely.
So there's no definition on it.
Sure.
But why don't we kind of play around with the history of Hawaiian cacao, just because that's where we are.
Right.
That's what we're starting to see more of for the first time. And the Mililani bar that we just made, which we did a video before on, that I thought was so amazing, you are also behind that.
Yeah, I designed that farm from the ground up
Right,
and also provide all the genetic material.
That's the third biggest farm in Hawaii at the moment?
I guess,
Maybe
it would be
fourth, whatever it is.
third,
It's
whatever.
one of the
Third,
bigger
fourth,
ones,
yeah.
and that tells you a lot about how big our industry is right now.
Because that was another cool thing, on like say it was one step back, with Freddy's, the farm, the Coast model, the farm was already there, right? And, got to do the process. With Mililani, it was like, okay, we have a blank field that we're going to plant, and I'm going to design the windbreaks and how the cacao trees go in and provided all the genetic material. That was super cool. And you're like stoked about this cacao.
Oh God, we went and visited, it was only like 4 months ago or something.
Yeah.
We went and visited the farm, and for me it was my first time visiting, amazingly. I can't believe it. But it was their first harvest and their first ferments.
Right.
And so I tasted what was on the drying rack. Semi-freaked out because I thought it was so amazing.
Right.
And then tried to buy everything from that ferment. And, well, we just won Best Chocolate Made at Origin, as well as Best Chocolate from the Chocolate Alliance, which is the Northwest Chocolate Festival's awards.
Yep.
But it's so nice to have that vindication, just because I did think it was so good. And so what makes that cacao come across as so unique? What did you do as far as designing it that made it such a fruit bomb?
I don't think I necessarily did I mean, I provided the genetics.
In some ways you did. Maybe you don't know what you did.
Well, I think it has to do with stress. I see this pattern.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, that
makes sense. I don't know. People don't like to necessarily paint this picture as Hawaii has a stressful environment for plants. Right? It's just kind of the opposite of what people think. But, unlike cacao growing areas, we have really strong winds. Right, we're very far north, so we have long days, right? At the equator, it's 12-12, right? The hours of daylight and sun, right? We have these long, hot days. Mililani's on a west-facing slope into the setting sun, just getting baked all day long.
Yep, it's really hot.
You have high solar radiation, right? And you have wind, and so you go up there and you look at those trees at the end of the harvest season. They look haggard.
Beat.
They look haggard, right?
Yeah, they weren't looking happy.
So
while we were there.
One of the patterns I've seen
Notice
throughout
that with
the world,
stuff out in Waialua as well.
Right. One of the patterns I've seen though with cacao is that and you'll see this with grapes, right? Happy grapes make kind of bland wine.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's a similar phenomenon going on with cacao. So you get this
depleted soils.
Well, not depleted. No, yeah, with wine grapes.
With grapes.
I mean, cacao, you want rich soils. You want the trees to grow, fast and healthy. But this constant impact of the sun and the heat and the wind, it stresses them out. So you get smaller fruits, you get smaller seeds. But I find you have like more concentrated flavors, and I had for a while it's only seen this in Hawaii. It hadn't been in any of these marginal growing environments, right? But you'll see the anomalai, India cacao from
those are also
Tamil
quite
Nadu,
interesting.
right? And I went down there with them to
Yeah, I liked those when I got the samples.
to revise all their post-harvest handling, right? And man, that is a dry, hot, breezy place. And if you taste those beans, they're pretty concentrated, pretty fruity.
Which is not where you think cacao would want to grow.
I don't know that it does really want to grow there.
No, it definitely doesn't.
But or here, really.
But so Hilo, which is perfect growing conditions. Everything we see from
Debatable,
Hilo,
it's kind of soft or subtle. I would use that's
a really nice.
I
way
might
to
use
put
a
it.
more blunt word typically myself.
I'm gonna go out and say it's bland.
Yeah, it's bland. Right.
Yeah, it's boring and it's bland in most cases.
Right.
I think that the drying, they could play with that and get more interesting results.
Yeah.
Which we've seen.
Right.
But generally,
Not much
it tastes
fruit.
the same everywhere, and we're not sure if that's the genetics.
Ooh,
that
that's.
But we're gonna find out in the next couple of years.
It's a little bit of both. Yeah, I know it's common.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the history of cacao in Hawaii, right, is that it was brought in around the Civil War, really just as a botanical curiosity, right? And because, botanic gardens, it was, try to find the most revered variety, so it was Criollo cacao. Not much happened. Nobody really commercially tried to grow it. Then with World War I and a lot of shipping lines getting interrupted, there was some interest in commercially producing cacao here, but World War II wrapped up, things back to normal. Nothing happened.
I think the cost still was prohibitive.
So the better part of a century goes by, and then we had two, failed attempts at commercialization, and unfortunately,
Attempt number one.
well, there was one that was called, what is it? Vintage. Hawaiian
vintage
cacao,
chocolate.
Hawaiian vintage, right? And
Yeah, you'll still see their website.
I know. And unfortunately, this was an individual that couldn't wait, and so he started importing. I don't know what it was, but South American beans, grinding it up with maybe
Mexican.
but with a handful of Hawaiian beans and calling it. And then he got caught. But the other thing...
Didn't he do something like... So besides being an excellent salesman and talking Hershey's and Dole into...
Yeah. Hershey's definitely got
collaborating.
involved. So some of that material that we still have floating around is actually from the Hershey Hummingbird Farm in Belize.
Oh, okay.
Now defunct.
And that's what went to Cacao on the Big Island.
Right. So
Okay.
what happened was he really scandalously misspent a lot of people's money, other people's money. Rode around in a limo, and then got caught fraudulently, marketing not Hawaiian chocolate. So that left a bad taste in people's
Well, I
mouth.
think the way he phrased it was he took the cacao that was planted here and took some of the seeds and went back to Mexico and then said, no, it's Hawaiian cacao. Something along those lines.
Oh, he definitely said he had, within like 2 years was like, I've bred the new variety, Hawaiian. He said, there's Criollo, Trinitario, Forastero, and Hawaiian. Whatever, that imploded, right? And a lot of people were like burned, There were some individuals at university, professors that were kind of involved, Hershey's, he had managed to court them and get them involved. Some pretty big players. And that went belly up and people were kind of like, ugh, cacao's no good, I don't know.
So that was late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
Okay, next time it failed.
So there was a second project, so this would have been...
This is good, by the way, whatever that one is.
That's a new hybrid that, I bred here, but we grow at Maui. And we're still testing. And actually, I gave that to the state so it can enter the public domain.
Excellent.
As a new kind of second generation. Okay. Anyway, next project, right, was actually Dole had a diversified agriculture program on the North Shore. So they were trying out, instead of just pineapple or, cane, they started growing mango and lychee higher up on the hills. They did some coffee and they did some cacao.
Oh, this is their 15 to 18 acres or something.
About 18 acres, right? And so they kind of wrapped up this diversified agriculture program.
Where did all that come from?
What's up?
The genetics that they've got planted.
It came from a university research station here. That university research station stuff was established from Cacao. This is all Upper Amazon crossed with
we're
Trinitario.
Going back to Hershey again. Their variety trials.
No, I don't think so. The Hershey stuff that came in was more of a straight old Trinitario type.
Okay.
This stuff initially came. Well, it's a long,
well, I know
long
that
path.
Tom Menezes and Mike Conway both went around the world.
It came from Philippines, and the Philippines stuff had come from Malaysia, and there the kind of trail runs cold. I mean, obviously it came from, I'm thinking Central America. If you look in Central American countries, you look at, say, Nicaragua, it's almost all old classic Trinitario. But if you look at Honduras, you look at El Salvador, you have, and Costa Rica, you have a mix. You have this Upper Amazon, Cartier, the research organization in Costa Rica, had done some breeding, and you have this kind of mutt-like mix, which actually is not a bad thing at all. Yeah. But anyway, what established Dole Waialua Estate, was this Upper Amazon Trinitario mix. Philippines, Malaysia. Before that, who knows? So what happened
planted sometime in the 90s.
Well, it'd be 25 years old now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Their orchard. And so what happened was they planted it along with all these other diversified ag, crops, and then kind of reversed course and said, this isn't really something we want to do. They kept the coffee. So they leased their cacao orchard to another one of these fly-by-night guys. I think it was Hawaii Gold Cacao Tree or something like that.
Wow. Never heard of this one.
These guys ran for a couple of years, couldn't pay the bills, misspent, everything. And then that orchard was entirely abandoned. So they got kicked off, left the state. Dole just left it abandoned. And a couple of years later, it was...
But it was old enough at that
to survive.
point.
Well, it's on the flood...
5 or 6
Yeah,
years
it's on the floodplain of the Waialua River.
Yeah.
So even though it wasn't getting irrigated, these trees hung on to dear life, and they were buried in 15-foot tall, what they call guinea grass. You couldn't even see the trees. So Dole cleared it all out. Started.
Well, they just kind of like all of a sudden said, "Hey, let's go see if those are alive." They
I don't know.
whacked it all.
I don't know what the impetus was to like rehab it, but they did.
It was probably Murdoch, since it was his pet project anyway.
It was, but I'm not going to speculate. I don't know why, but they did. They rehabbed it and they started growing it and in earnest. And now the trees are old enough to start producing. And they didn't really know much. They tried a little bit of fermentation, wasn't very good. They were working with Guittard, and then they ended up bringing up Darren Suka. From Trinidad. So he's been a long time, cacao researcher, and he did kind of what I do, now around the world is he did the post-harvest kind of, changes for them. And then they got some evaluations and people said like, wow, this is some world-class stuff right here.
Just stress the heck out of it.
Well, I don't know. But it's funny, Dole doesn't get a lot of love. I'm not gonna comment on, whether that's deserved or not. I mean, they are the largest grower of fruits and maybe even vegetables in the world, a single entity. Anyway,
Wow.
they don't get a lot of love being a big multinational corporation. But, you got to give them credit for being the first entity in Hawaii to commercialize cacao and demonstrate the proof of concept.
The intention for it, at least.
Two things. One, it could produce really quite well, yield-wise, but also that it had a very unique, world-class flavor. So a lot of people, I think, were inspired by that. But even when we met 10 years ago, there was essentially no other commercial farm. There wasn't.
There wasn't, yeah.
There wasn't.
No, I remember talking to Derek Lancer, who was whatever type of farm management position there, and like, hey, can I buy a bag of cacao? And he's like, I don't even know what to sell it to you for.
Yeah.
And we came up with
we
some
were there.
price of like $8 a pound or something.
It was $8 a pound.
Which didn't last too long as soon as they realized that the idea was to make chocolate and that Manoa chocolate would one day be competition,
Right.
and they stopped selling.
Well, it's funny. I mean, you and I in Hawaii in the whole cacao and chocolate thing were, I mean, obviously, I think we both kind of live in and breathe this stuff in our respective sides. But I mean, right place, right time. I mean,
Yes.
the emergence of the craft
absolutely.
chocolate market.
I don't think it would have worked 10 years before.
No.
The
So this
market wasn't
immersion of
ready.
this whole specialty bean to bar craft chocolate kind of sector really put the idea in a lot of small growers' heads.
Yeah, there was something about 2010 because there was quite a few of the makers that we currently see that are dominating the industry that started around that time.
Yeah. So, now we're in this phase where, there are either under development or, starting to mature, a number of farms. And, you need this minimum. There's an economy of scale with cacao growing. So I typically advise people, right? So my work outside of the country is almost exclusively post-harvest handling, right? And fermentation. And then I import some of this cacao myself. Because, like, for example, the Salazars, because Esmeraldas were like, well, this cacao is great. And, people want to buy it, but how the hell do we get this in the United States and get it into people's hands? And so that's how I accidentally
we
became an importer.
did a full episode on this because everyone has this idea that there's not enough good cacao out there and there's too many craft chocolate makers. It's the other way around.
I think there's too much good cacao nowadays.
Exactly, and that's what we explained because it was so much easier for a 100-hectare farm to hire someone like you and all of a sudden be producing really good cacao.
Right.
And not enough buyers because craft chocolate's still so small that it hasn't penetrated the market in a large enough way through, say Whole Foods. This is another episode we did where we tasted every bar on the shelf at Whole Foods.
Right.
98% of those, 90% of them was the same chocolate with a different label. Endangered species.
Right.
Lilies, XOXO Choco Love.
Right.
It's Divine. It's all the same stuff. It's all Calabo. And
Calabo,
they
right.
might have their own
the
recipe
formulation.
tweaks.
Right, yeah, for sure.
But they're just buying containers of chocolate, melting it, and putting a label on it. It's
Right.
all West African cocoa for the most part. I mean, they might have a bit of Indonesia mixed in there, a bit of Brazil, whatever, their formulation.
Right.
It's not unique in any way. And so craft chocolate needs to do a better job taking over those SKUs, those shelf positions in health food stores, at least to start. Especially stores and health food stores.
Well, how much of it is craft chocolate? I think craft chocolate makers
almost
are ready
none of
to
it.
upgrade and increase their volume. I mean, what I see,
But
right?
it's not that easy. It's not like I can pump in $5 million.
No, but it's consumers. These are like you just talked about Whole Foods, right? I go into Whole Foods.
Well, it's a combination.
Almost every time I'm in Whole Foods, I'll walk by the chocolate aisle, and sometimes there's nobody there. But I'd say that the vast majority, or actually, I think every single time I've been there, I see people stop and they kind of look and they look up and down and, and they reach for that $3 to $4 chocolate bar. Mm-hmm. And yours is right there, but it's $8. And, these are people that are, it's a whole paycheck. I mean, they're spending, but there still seems to be, even amongst, people that, Whole Food shoppers, right, is a different demographic than, people that, shop at the bargain grocery stores, right? People are a little more likely to spend on specialty products, but I still, without fail, see people grabbing. I would love to see what the volumes are.
Everyone's price
So the thing is, until that,
price sensitive.
Until that demand is there for $8, $10 chocolate bars, I mean, you run into a wall. And it's funny with this whole oversupply. I mean, way back, 10, 15 years ago, I mean, hey, it was Bertil, Madagascar, right? There's a handful of origins floating around, and people were kind of scrambling, after those.
Right. The pendulum swung.
And the funny thing is,
like chocolate makers market instead of a bean sellers market.
Absolutely is the case.
Which it'll swing back. It's just going to be another 5 years maybe.
Right. Well,
everyone needs to keep growing. Like, we need to hit 100 tons a year, not 20.
Right.
And
please buy more containers.
You get 10 chocolate makers hitting 100, 200 tons, and all of a sudden it starts to make a dent.
Right. Well, the other thing is, there is a lot of new and kind of fresh faces still opening up, and they're friendly and they're eager and they have a lot of questions. But the funny thing is, I see this, when I sell cacao, this inverse relationship between volume and difficulty in completing the sale. Is you got these little guys, they want 1 or 2 bags and they got a billion questions. They don't know how to organize shipping. Mm-hmm. And the thing I don't think they realize either is, for their freight company to take it has to be on a pallet, right? A pallet can hold 8 bags.
Yeah.
But the
that's
pallet,
something that I didn't realize in the beginning either.
Right.
I didn't understand it. The company was so small, I had no experience, and it was fragile.
Right.
Everything works in volume.
Right. Well, the thing is,
you don't want to sell 3 bags of cacao. You want to sell a container.
I want to sell, pallets
and you'll
containers.
discount your price in order to sell a container, because it's the same amount of work almost for you to sell a container or 5 bags of cocoa.
Container sales are typically the easiest ones for me to execute, as far as
it also means you're working with a customer that knows what they're doing.
Right. And it's funny, chocolate makers too, and I get this, right? There's so many makers in the U.S. now, and there is only so many beans, and so people are kind of like, well, how do I differentiate myself other than my label, my packaging, my quality? But to a consumer that's just looking at this bewildering array of chocolates, I think a lot of these makers are like, oh, what's the next new hot origin? What's the one that not everyone else has yet? And I get that desire, but the problem is, they leave, their regular standbys kind of in the lurch for a bit. And what happens, you circle back, it's even these, all these specialty cocoa suppliers, even though they're getting double, triple market price, it's still not, it's kind of like it's like making chocolate. Like, you gotta kind of love it. And my fear is that, this quest, what's funny too is then they come back and they say, well, I bought 4 bags of Esmeraldas, or I bought 4 bags of whatever, last year, and then I got a new shipment. It's like a new year, it's a new harvest, it might have been rainy or whatever, and they're like, oh, it's not bad, but it's just different. And I'm kind of like, well, of course it's different.
Yeah.
The thing is, if you want your consumers, if they're going to come in, I mean, I see this, like, and spend $8 in a chocolate bar, they like the 75% Esmeraldas, right? And they're going to shell out $8 for it. They don't want to come back 6 months later and buy that same exact product, and it tastes very, very different. So one of the things I try to convince these chocolate makers to do is like, dude, look, you're going to get a volume discount. I know you're going to have to like find storage space, but like, get as much as you can possibly get in one go, because it makes it, all those costs trickle down to take out of, either the broker or the producer or whatever. I think
this is one of the things that is lacking or not understood well enough in the craft chocolate world, is just the fact that it's still a business and you need to operate a certain way in order for it to be successful. It's something we should probably do more episodes on, just because people don't understand supply chains and financial statements and how to work with a broker, that it's okay to work with a broker. Everyone's got this idea that, okay, you have to do direct trade. It's a nice idea, but if you're super small, you can't do direct trade. In fact, it's a pain for whoever you're trying to work with, for you to be making 400 kilos a year and direct trading.
Right.
You need to work with a broker.
I mean,
and there's some great roles that brokers really play.
Sure.
It shouldn't be discounted.
I guess, to talk about a little bit of controversy though, with direct trade, I see, a mass amount of chocolate bars say direct trade, but they're buying it from a broker, and in often cases there's intermediaries, brokers that like, I don't know, I feel like if you're buying it from the farmer, right? So the way I sell Esmeraldas and Ucayali, right, is I import it all, right? I take possession of that. I do the sales and the distribution. But when I invoice people, you pay Ucayali River Cacao, or you pay Esmeraldas, right? You don't pay me. And so, I don't know, is that direct trade? I mean, the financial transaction is taking place.
At that point, you're almost just playing a role with the company that somebody would have to do.
Right.
So that's still not going to go away whether you have someone within your company or you have someone else doing it.
Yeah.
To me, that still sounds like direct trade, because you're still sending the money directly to the farmer.
Right, but what if you buy it from, a broker who's actually using a commodity company that takes possession, insures the freight, and maybe even warehouses it. It's distributed by another company, and there's several layers there, and I'm not sure you can fairly call that direct trade. You do not know how much of your dollar
It gets fuzzy.
is getting to the farm gate, right? But when you pay for Costa Esmeraldas, you know exactly who that money is going to. It's not the farm gate, it's like it's a landed, X warehouse cost, but, like you buy the Esmeraldas from Salazar family. That's who you pay, right?
That's who we send money to.
I might import it for you.
Yeah, but we don't have the license to do it.
Right? Because I'm not taking part in the financial transaction. I'm getting compensated, right? But that's separate.
To wrap this up, what do you think the Hawaiian cacao industry will look like in 10 years?
In 10 years.
I want to know your guess on volume of acreage and what will this industry look like? Because together we have been integral in helping to shape it.
Right. Well,
and that was part of a dream 10 years ago. So it'll be 20 years of us working in this industry, collaborating on what this will look like in different ways.
10 years. All right. Well, let's look at what's happened in the last 10 years, right? So 10 years ago, Dole had 18 acres of cacao, and you had a bunch of small scattered growers, like sub 1 acre, right? I don't think I knew anyone much larger than that.
Everyone was sub 1 acre besides Dole.
Pretty much. There was maybe some people with an acre or two, but how do you qualify? Yeah. I would say part of the qualification there is an acre, say 450 trees that are like healthy and producing. I've met many people that's like, oh wait, hey, I got 10 acres of cacao on the ground,
dead,
but I'd say that
sticks.
20% of them are actually ever going to be trees. So since then, right, now you've got Dole with 80 acres, right? You've got, on this island, we've got Nililani with 10 acres, mature, bearing cacao. We
might have 6 in the next 6 months.
We have 1 acre we put in this year.
I think we have more than that now. I think we have 1.5 acres.
But by the end of 2021, we'll definitely have 3 acres planted, right? So now we're looking at, going from 18 acres 10 years ago on this island to 80 plus 10 plus, and then you get some scattered people.
I'd say Ben and Kahalu alone has got about 7 acres planted.
Yeah, so we're at about 100 acres.
Waimanalo's got maybe a couple.
20 to 100 is pretty good, right? On Maui, I've got 20 acres in the ground, 10 of which are producing. You see some small guys over there with 1 acre or 2. But now Big Island, right, you have a bunch of guys with 1 acre, 2 acres, kind of 3 acres.
And then up to 20 acres of struggling sticks.
Yeah, exactly. So, I would say, you've got 120. I'd say it would be a stretch to say there's any more than 150 acres legitimate cacao in the entire state.
In 2020.
Yeah. When you think about it like that, right?
It's really small.
Costa Esmeraldas is 100 hectares, right? 2.5 acres per. So you got
that's practically double what we have now.
250 acres of cacao on a single estate. Let me show you the scale. And then, world production is 5 million metric tons annually, right? And,
Okay, so
We produce a couple
got maybe
containers.
150 acres.
Right.
We did just have one farm attempt to plant out 200.
200, yeah. And I think that was trying to bite off. I mean, I recommend people start with 10 acres and cut your teeth and learn that it's going to be an uphill slog for a while. I mean, I think the real limiting factor is
Our costs here.
well, absolutely. But you put the labor and the material cost, everything has to get shipped out here, right? And what you pay people hourly. Is really there's only so many areas that have the right kind of nexus of soil, water supply, favorable lease terms, exposure, or lack of exposure to wind. I mean, I've done this for a lot of clients, and you pare it down, it's not really that much space. So, I mean, if people continue to, I see it as there's two models in Hawaii that work, right? There's grow cacao and value add by actually like investing in infrastructure to manufacture yourself and equipment. But that's a huge barrier to entry for a lot of people, right?
Yes, definitely.
The second model is, well,
That's what we do
get
for a lot of
somebody
customers now.
to grow good cacao, and then you process it to them, and they market and brand it, and maybe combine it with some agritourism. And then you have people like Mililani, right, who had an ag business. So here's the thing, right? They have the land, they have the equipment.
They're just diversifying.
They're diversifying, right? So you'll see, I think, in the next 10 years, you'll see some of these diversified ag guys they already got the equipment, they already got the know-how to grow tree and orchard crops. And, if they get big enough, they might bite off and get their own equipment. But I think in the meantime, they're going to use you or they're going to use our company on Maui to contract manufacture. I think that works. But I mean, you're still looking at millions of dollars to put together a single, I mean, just look at how much actual productive fruit tree crops are there in Hawaii.
Yeah, the only way
Not
we've
cacao.
realized it works is by adding value. And that's because we're semi-vertical integration.
So, I mean, we have an amazing site. I mean, I had given up on Oahu for good, available farm parcels until we got our site. I know we can get 25 or 30 acres there. Mililani might expand. So I could see maybe 200 acres on Oahu. I don't know if any of these big guys are really taking the leap to make a serious 10-plus acre farm. A handful of guys will. I mean, I don't know. I think in 10 years, it might be 250, 300. And I just don't know. I don't see it past that.
Yeah. And Oahu's more limiting probably than most places. But Waialua is, I think, is the right kind of conditions with wind blocks.
It's pretty good. Our soil's amazing. We're right in the shadow of the highest peak on Oahu, so we get a little bit more cloud cover, a little bit more rain. I think it's a good site. It's a great site. But I don't know, all said and done, honestly, I don't think this limited acreage is necessarily a bad thing. I think it's, as the collective pool of knowledge, you look at, say, Kona Coffee and things like that. I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge that's exists and is shared throughout the community of how to grow cacao. We're still not there yet, but it's building as these commercial farms are really coming online in the last 10 years. And it's going to inspire more people. And I got to say, there's wild cards that I encounter pretty regularly.
There always will be.
But
we got the call a few years ago saying that somebody had 20 acres of planted cacao. We had no idea who they were.
Right. But, hey, a couple hundred acres of cacao for Hawaii, I think is actually very meaningful. If you look at our current agricultural status and, the past legacy of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres of sugar, we don't really have much left. So 100 acres and something that's not a commodity like sugar, something that kind of has an identity, and that has the quality. It's not like there's inevitably the people that don't make good chocolate, the few here in Hawaii, they're going to thin out. It's a hard business, right? So I think in 10 years...
Yes, it's a hard business. And then we can talk about what you guys are dealing with on Maui with everything from fires to just building out a chocolate factory to operating to sales. It's not an easy business to enter and create.
Right.
It's a new industry, and shoot, right now it's December, right? So we're all working a lot
Yeah.
to hang in there. And manufacturing here is a really tricky thing to do.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think a couple hundred acres of really excellent chocolate. I kind of see that as a
In 10 years.
calculate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
300 acres.
I can see that as well.
But we're gonna have some really new, really distinct varieties because that's a.
So you're just measuring it off of acreage, though. But what about like, agritourism and the whole
and
concept?
Yeah, so that's what's going to make it all work so well for us, is because we can incorporate the 10 million tourists we saw last year into sales of cacao. And so if it does turn into what we expect it to, most tourists who come here will want to bring home chocolate from Hawaii because it's unique and special, because it tastes like tart cherries.
Yeah.
Which is something that no one really wraps their head around at the moment in the chocolate world when they buy a Hershey bar off the shelf.
Sure.
And so, okay, you'll still spend $10 to buy a chocolate bar if it's that special and take it home. It's not price prohibitive. It's still an affordable luxury, and tourism will support it. And so 10 million people buying one chocolate bar is still a lot of chocolate bars.
Yeah.
So the industry has a lot of potential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, we can see how many acres we can plant. Hopefully it's 400 or 500 acres.
There's
Okay, well, on that note, this has been another episode of Craft Chocolate TV. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.